Welcome to the 9th session of the ECPS virtual workshop series, We the People and the Future of Democracy, Interdisciplinary Approaches. This online series follows ECPS's in-person conference at Oxford University in July 2025 and continues the vital discussions initiated there. My name is Stella Schade, an intern with ECPS. I recently graduated from the London School of Economics and will soon start working as a research assistant for a German think tank. ECPS curates this virtual workshop series to address one of the most pressing questions of our time, how the idea of the people shapes the fate of democracy. By examining how the people can serve as both a sword and a shield, namely a democratic force and a tool of authoritarian consolidation, this series fosters interdisciplinary dialogue to better understand democratic backsliding, resilience, and the future of democracy worldwide. Today's session, Populism, Crime, and the Politics of Exclusion, brings together emerging and established scholars to examine how populist politics intersect with crime, security, migration, and contested boundaries of belonging. The panel explores how narratives of law and order, criminality, and threat are mobilized to legitimize political authority, marginalize targeted groups, and reshape democratic norms across diverse contexts. Through the analyses, the session highlights how crime and exclusion function not only as policy domains, but also as powerful political languages. Collectively, the papers interrogate how fear, moral binaries, and claims of popular justice are translated into enduring forms of political mobilization, often blurring the line between democratic representation and authoritarian practice. ECPS is going to write a workshop report and share the video recording of this event on its website and YouTube channel. With this, I introduce the distinguished moderator, presenters, and discussants for today's session. So today's workshop is going to be moderated by Dr. Helen L. Murphy. Dr. Murphy is a postdoctoral scholar at the Mershon Center for International Security Studies at The Ohio State University. She earned a PhD in International Relations from the University of St. Andrews in 2023, where she was a Carnegie PhD scholar. Her research interests include populism, conspiracy theories, religious social movements, and migration. Dr. Christopher N. Magno will be our first speaker today to discuss From Crime Shows to Power, the Rise of Criminal Populism. Dr. Magno is an associate professor in the Department of Justice Studies and Human Services at Gannon University. He holds a PhD in criminal justice from Indiana University, Bloomington, with research focusing on criminology, spatial justice, and state violence. His work examines the epidemiology of violence, the intersection of crime and politics, and the criminalization of poverty and race. He coined the term criminal populism to describe how politicians exploit crime as political capital. The second presentation of today's panel will be jointly delivered by Dr. Russell Foster and Dr. Murad Akhtas on the topic, the legitimization process of the FPÖs and the NR's migration policies. Dr. Foster is a senior lecturer in British and international politics at King's College London. His current research focuses on the relationship between the far right and European identity, the far right and LGBTQ+ politics, the legacy of the British Empire in contemporary politics, and the evolving relationship between identity and politics in the UK, the EU, and beyond. Dr. Murad Akhtas is a professor of political science at Mus Alparslan University in Turkey. His current research focuses on radical right and populist movements in Europe, artificial intelligence, techno-oligarchy, human rights, and democracy. Unfortunately, our third speaker, Dr. Astolfi, couldn't join us today due to other commitments. So Saga Oskarsson-Kinstrand will be our last speaker, presenting a paper titled Going Populist, Revitalizing Membership-Based Politics Through Populist Linkage. Saga Oskarsson-Kinstrand is a doctoral candidate at Sciences Po Center for European Studies and Comparative Politics. Her research examines how political parties function as intermediaries between society and the state, with a particular focus on how European populist radical right parties develop party-based linkages. She explores how these parties mobilize active memberships despite broader trends of political disengagement, and how their claim to represent the people is reflected in party organization. Following the presentations, our discussants Hannah Geddes and Dr. Vlad Surdeya Hernea will each offer 12 to 13 minutes of commentary and feedback. Hannah Geddes is a PhD candidate at the University of St. Andrews. Her research explores how UK policies surrounding support for asylum seekers are understood, reshaped, and delivered at the local level against the background of outsourcing and high levels of politicization. Hannah Geddes has experience working in public sector auditing and in NGO community organizations which support displaced people in Greece and the UK. Dr. Vlad Surdeya Hernea is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna. He holds a PhD in political science from the Central European University. Dr. Surdeya Hernea is a quantitative political scientist with interests in political behavior, party politics, and historical political economy. His research examines the interaction between proximate and distal factors in shaping how individuals express their political preferences through voting, protesting, and climate change-related activism. As a reminder, we will have a Q&A session after the completion of the presentations and discussants' feedback and presenters' brief response. The participants can write their questions in the chat box or by raising their virtual hand and post their questions in person. So now, yeah, over to you, Helen.
Great, thank you so much. And first of all, Happy New Year to everyone. I'd like to give a big thank you to ECPS as well as to all of our presenters for making this event possible, as well as for those of you in the audience joining us today. So as Stella mentioned, this session is on populism, crime, and the politics of exclusion, and it consists of 3 very interesting interdisciplinary papers that I think work very well together, as you'll see. So our topic, the intersection of populism, crime, and exclusion, is a complex and a compelling one. Exclusionary populism, which is the focus of all of the papers that are being presented today, argues for the political empowerment of what the exclusionary populists consider to be the authentic people, and the exclusion of those who are deemed to be other. These others are often stigmatized as exclusionary populists link them with a variety of social problems, including crime. And then against this backdrop, exclusionary populists present themselves as representatives of security, law, and order, which they argue have been neglected as well by mainstream political parties and social, economic, and political elites more generally. And this aligns with this common observation that populists characterize themselves and the people that they purport to represent as reluctantly political, incentivized into politics through this sense of crisis. In recent years, these exclusionary tendencies have become increasingly prominent, both through the rise of exclusionary populist political actors, but also, I would argue, through the adoption of these narratives of crisis, identity, security, and exclusion by more mainstream parties. The political mainstreaming of exclusionary populism and the broader diffusion of these ideas have confronted scholars of populism with several critical questions. So firstly, how do these exclusionary politics change over time? And how do they become intertwined with other political issues, such as crime and security, as well as the links to broader popular culture? Secondly, what implications does this hold for democratic societies and norms? In what ways should those defending democratic norms respond to this securitization? And thirdly, as populists mobilize using mechanisms of identity by claiming to represent the people, how does this impact their own self-perceptions as well as their own political structures? The papers in this session, I think, shed very important light on these very timely questions. Drawing on different case studies across the globe and using diverse methodologies and different theoretical frameworks. They offer a very interesting lens into what is certain understudied elements of populist exclusionary politics that are very critical to understanding its growth and development. And at the same time, they invite us to reflect on how, over time, exclusionary populists have adapted their discourses and redrawn boundaries of identity as they become more integrated into the political sphere. Taken together, I think these papers will help us to understand the myriad impacts of exclusionary populism by encouraging us to explore not just its directly political dimensions, but also the emotive and affective aspects that animate it, as well as its links to securitization, relationships between grassroots politics and political organizations, and its intersection with popular culture and entertainment in various respects. As we'll see, exclusion becomes entangled with populist imaginaries through a variety of mechanisms, and in turn, political claims become grafted onto related dichotomies such as law and criminality, security and insecurity, authenticity and inauthenticity. And I think, as we'll as will come up in the discussion here today, the contours of exclusion created by these populist divisions between the people and the elite are not fixed, but they're often vague by design, allowing them to shift over time and to respond to new grievances. And I think I look forward to parsing through in the presentations and in the discussion the implications that this holds for democratic politics today. I'll leave it there for now, but I'll pass the floor on to Chris with our first presentation. Thank you.
Please, mic, please. Mic is closed.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So my name again is Chris Magno. I am a professor at Gannon University. I've been at Gannon for 15 years. And I completed my PhD in criminal justice at Indiana University in Bloomington. And my dissertation is about crime as a political capital in the Philippines. So when I arrived here in the United States to do my PhD, I encountered the concept of penal populism. So penal populism in the United States is about the crime warrior politicians. It's coined by John Pratt. There's a really good book of John Pratt. The title is Penal Populism. So when we talk about crime warrior politicians, this is all about the war against drugs, the war against illegal immigrants, the war against terror. So when we talk about those war against, it's all about how to criminalize the identity of the minority, people of color, of African American, Hispanic, Asian, and now the war against illegal immigrants. So it's all about othering, and there's a division between the we and them. The we is the white fragile identity of the middle class that needs to be protected, and then the them are the outsider that needs to wage the war against. But this conception of penal populism, when I started writing my dissertation, shifted, and I really thought this is only like a third world phenomenon when Trump won the presidency. And as we all know, when Trump was running as a president, he has tremendous amount of criminal records. Okay, so criminality has become a credentials, not only in the Philippines but also in the United States, which is the topic of my forthcoming book through the university, New York University Press, Criminal Populism: The Power of Crime as Political Capital. It's a comparative study between the US and the Philippines. So criminality has become a credential that occurs in the arsenal of contemporary populist campaigns and leadership. It's no longer relegated to the shadows or regarded as disqualifying criminal acts, whether proven or pending, now form a central part of the political playbook for leaders who thrive on defiance, spectacle, grievance, and the performance of the victimhood. The convergence of populism and criminality has become a defining feature of present political life, warranting urgent attention within the criminology, sociology, and of course in populist studies. So while earlier scholarship, like what I said, particularly in the US, focused on the rise of the crime warrior politicians promoting punitive agenda as more complex dynamics has emerged, increasingly, political figures facing legal charges or possessing criminal records are not merely surviving scandal, but weaponizing their criminal identity to consolidate power. So rather than being undermined by their criminality, these leaders reframe it as a mark of authenticity, portraying themselves as victims of elite persecution and champions of the common people. So this shift signals a departure from traditional penal populism, as defined by Jan Pratt, toward a new political formation in which crime itself functions as a form of political capital. Donald Trump's enduring influence in American politics, even while facing multiple felony indictments, reflect a broader transformation. His continued ability to mobilize supporters, raise substantial funds, and remain competitive in polls and legal battles indicates a deeper shift in democratic norms. This is not an isolated case. In the 2018 US midterm election, several candidates under criminal investigation or facing charges still secured electoral victories. A similar trend is evident in the Philippines, where a majority of candidates facing trial, ongoing investigation, or prior offenses won in both the 2019 and 2025 elections. These cases show a growing global trend where politicians use their criminal cases to gain support, turning legal trouble into a political advantage. This emerging pattern is the focus of my forthcoming book. It introduced the concept of criminal populism, offering a comparative and theoretically grounded framework to understand how crime, spectacle, and populist charisma intersect political legitimacy in democracies under strain. The study is based on my research from 2001 to the present. Criminal populism refers to a political strategy in which leaders transform criminal records, legal entanglements, or public scandals into instrument of political strength. Rather than concealing their legal troubles, criminal populists publicly embrace them, casting themselves as victims of political persecution. In doing so, they reframe their transgression as proof of authenticity and defiance, positioning themselves as champion of the people against a corrupt and self-serving elite. Unlike traditional penal populists, who gain political capital by targeting others through punitive laws, criminal populists turn the justice system itself into a stage. Their strength lies not merely in enacting harsh policies, not only in enacting harsh policies, but also in choreographing spectacles, fabricating threats, staging emotional rituals of law and order, and transforming legal scrutiny into political theater. Indictments, arrests, and trials become badges of honor, reaffirming their outsider status and galvanizing disillusioned publics. So my research tells the story behind those performances. It traces how a single mugshot, for example, of Joseph Estrada, helped ignite a populist resurgence in the Philippines, while the same image fueled multi-million-dollar funding in the United States in case of Trump. It recounts how one punitive soldier launched a coup, went into hiding, and still won a Senate seat, and how another openly bragged about killing someone, and I'm talking about Rodrigo Duterte here, and even vowed to kill again if elected, only to win the presidency by framing that violence as authenticity. It follows a figure who began his political ascent by eliminating his father's rival and ended it after being linked to an assassination of an opposition leader on the airport tarmac in the Philippines before quietly slipping into the US exile. And I'm talking about Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos Sr. here, the father of Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the current president of the Philippines. And it examines how scandal made another leader more appealing, not less, his popularity growing as accountability faded. So in my research, I identified 4 archetypes of politicians who use crime as political capital. So the first type is the crime warrior politicians, and I already presented the example. And a good example of crime warrior politicians, not only Trump, but also Bill Clinton. So Bill Clinton when he was, his law and order politics. And I intentionally chose Bill Clinton because he is a Democrat, because there's a common understanding that uh, the law and order identity is exclusively for Republicans, but the incarceration rate of African American, despite of the low crime rate in the United States, went up during the time of Bill Clinton.
Hi, Chris.
Because
Really quickly, your slides aren't moving. Would you be able to maybe try to share your screen again or something like that? We're just still seeing the original slide.
okay.
Yeah, it's working now.
Okay, there you go. So yeah, we have Trump, and this is Joseph Strada. When I started studying Joseph Strada, when I was back home in the Philippines doing my master's degree in sociology in the University of the Philippines, and at the same time I work as a community organizer among the urban poor. And um, the urban poor that I was organizing back then, when I was in the Philippines, ended up supporting Joseph Strada, and this is him right here, despite a plunder case against him. And he was ousted as a president, and he was incarcerated, and his mugshot photo ignite the third people power revolution in the Philippines. Like millions of urban poor rally in support of him and tried to put him back into power, which has experienced similar version 5 years ago in the United States, when the the MAGA movement mobilized into the White House, in DC, which it's the 5th year anniversary of that event. So in my research, again, I have four types of politicians who use crime as political capital. So the first one is the crime warrior politicians, and the second one is the criminal populist politicians. So the criminal politicians. So these are politicians who are involved in crime themselves. They are confessed criminal, like President Rodrigo Duterte, who is under under the custody right now of the International Criminal Court. During the election campaign, he confessed that he killed somebody when he was the mayor of Davao, and he's ready to kill for more. Uh, to for his war on drugs. If you are a rapist and you are a user of drugs, he can kill for more. So they are not really shy. They're not afraid. They are so expressive that they have that killer instinct, that they have that identity as a criminal. Okay. So the third type of criminal populists, in my book, are the political criminals. So political criminals like Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King Jr. But in the case of the Philippines, these are the politicians who fought against corruption, who fought against dictators, and because of those actions that they did, they've been criminalized by the state. The state manufactured a crime against them, and through that criminal identity, that rebellion identity that they had, they entered politics and they won. Okay, and the fourth type is the the fourth type of politicians is the fastest, the criminal. The fastest criminal, it's like a combination of the crime warrior politicians and uh the criminal politicians. So they are crime warrior, but at the same time they are lawbreaker. They are willing to break the law um to implement their crime warrior agenda. They're, like Donald Trump. Um, the classic example of that is Donald Trump. So my research identifies the crime warrior politicians, the criminal politicians, the political criminal, and the fascist criminal politicians. Oh, there you go. So, like what I discussed, the crime warrior politicians, these politicians capitalize on their identities as crime fighters. They enhance their political careers by taking top position against crime. They win election in part by mobilizing the proportionate amounts of governmental resources to wage war against types of crime that effectively speak to public and societies, such as those related to illegal drugs, immigration, terrorism, and communism. So this table shows how the Republican won the 1984 and 1988 presidential elections because of their tougher positions on crime compared to the softer position of the Democrats. Then after that, Bill Clinton changed his rhetoric that he is tougher than the Republican. So as according to his statement here, we need more police on the street, and there's a crime bill which would put more police on the streets, which was killed for decision by the Republicans. So the narrative is a contest between who is a tougher in crime. And during the time of President Bill Clinton, and as you can see in this table, every time he signed a new crime bill and turned that into act, his popularity rating goes up. And again, like what I said, during the time of President Bill Clinton, and this is during his time, the incarceration rate in the United States went up, despite that property and violent crime is going down, but the incarceration rate is going up. And especially the incarceration rate of African American. And here's another data, the African American population going up during the time of Bill Clinton. Okay, so this is the the framework that I use and how the politicization of crime works. So it starts with the crime propaganda, and that crime propaganda create that fear of crime among the white middle class here in the United States. And then once the politician won into office, the politicians mobilized the criminal justice system, you name it, from the police, from the police force. Right now, it's the ICE and the courts. So, and the Congress, and the Senate. So they mobilize those for their war on crime. And while this cycle is going, it enhances the popularity and charisma of the politicians. So while it enhances the popularity and charisma, that identity and charisma of the politicians, it's also criminalized the identity of the other, especially of the African American and the immigrants and the minority. So this is the framework of the penal populism. Okay, but for the criminal populism, it's actually like changes, because the criminalized identity, because there's a victimhood there, like the criminal populace can change the framing of victimhood, like the victim here is the middle class, who are out of job because of the illegal immigrant, right? So or in the case of the Philippines, the victim here are the ordinary citizens who just want to do their job, go to work, and because of, like illegal use of drugs, so we have cases of rape, and all this rhetoric and narrative of victimizations. And the other thing here, most of the victim of this crime against are the poor. There's no such thing as crimes against white collar crime. Like war against the crime of the elite, like environmental destruction or corruptions and other things. So I'm just showing you here in this PowerPoint the top issues concerned by the American voters in the last presidential elections. As you can see here, the first is the economy and the second is crime. And that is the reason why crime as a rhetoric is so effective during elections here in the United States. So this is back in 2025 election. So this is the second one, the criminal politicians. So the crime warrior, and now we have the criminal politicians. Uses crime that he or she has committed as political capital, and these politicians have faced criminal charges placed by legal institutions. Some have participated directly in crime and had been convicted of committing criminal acts. They then use processes of the criminal justice system, such as their own arrest, trial, incarceration, to turn their crimes into political capital. Criminal politicians build their relationship with the voting public through the publicity accorded to their crimes. And the third one is the political criminal, and this type of politicians has led protests and revolutionary actions against corrupt and dictatorial leaders, and their acts of protest or dissent are criminalized through political intervention in legal processes, for example, through executive orders, the weaponization of the law, the president's influence within the criminal justice processes. So these protesters and dissenters then turn their criminalized identities into political capital. And a good example of that is in the Philippines is Gregorio Honasan. So Gregorio Honasan, he staged a total of 11 coup d'etat against the government. Like every time he ran as a senator, he's gonna stage a coup, and he's gonna be wanted and hiding, and then he's gonna win. And once his term is over, he's gonna stage another coup d'etat and run again as a senator, and then won. And it's like a non-stop cycle of coup d'etat. And he mastered that skills, and there's so many people who followed. There's so many military officers who followed his footstep. And the fastest criminal politicians. So these are the fastest criminal politicians combine the characteristics of the crime warrior politicians with those of the criminal politicians by both committing and fighting crime. So former President Rodrigo Duterte exemplifies this type of politicians. Duterte launched his campaign for the presidency in 2015 by promising to kill drug dealers and other criminals. In the same campaign, Duterte argued that he was willing to and capable of killing people because he had killed somebody before as a teenager and then later as a mayor of Davao in the southern Philippines. So the fastest criminal politicians challenges political opponents through a professed or demonstrated willingness to use extrajudicial lethal violence against population perceived as criminal. So the fastest criminal politicians mobilize both the judicial force and extrajudicial violence to demonstrate their opposition to other types of criminals. So in democracies, fastest criminal politicians exceed their constitutional powers, acting as dictators to bypass legal processes in a war against crime. So my other research that I started during the first term of Duterte back in 2015, I started documenting drug war killings in the Philippines, and I was able to document 8,000 killings, and now those documentation is under consideration by the International Criminal Court, and they're gonna use those as evidence against Duterte to show.
I think we're running a little low on time, so if you could wrap up in the next minute or so, that would be great. Thank you.
So that is the last part of my type of criminal populist, and I'm just gonna end my presentation there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I think next we have Russell's presentation.
Thank you very much. Yes, so I'm afraid I don't have slides for this, so I'll be giving this paper on the legitimization of the politics of exclusion and anti-immigration rhetoric by the FPO in Austria and the National Rally in France, a depressingly apt topic for the start of 2026, when the radical right seems to be accelerating worldwide. So I have a very bad habit of not keeping to time in my classes, so I'll try to keep this to 12 minutes. So can you hear me okay? Perfect, excellent. So this is a paper which has been, being written by myself and Professor Murat Aktas, who's done the lion's share of the work. So I would like to start by thanking Professor Aktas for all of his hard work on this over Christmas. So we're looking at the legitimization of migration policies in the European radical right. And we're approaching this from two angles. The first one being the distinctions between anti-immigrant rhetoric and criminalization of, narratives of criminalization of migration between European countries. So the first angle, looking at how there are similarities between the rhetorics coming out of different radical right populist parties in Europe, but also national variations. Throughout the literature on the radical right, there seems to be a tendency towards assuming that there is a single radical right populism across the Western world and across Europe. Certainly, there are a great many similarities. However, the approach that we're taking is that these can often be rather superficial similarities, and that there are very significant regional, national, and local differences between them, which do not help to explain the extent to which these policies are gaining traction as they become more mainstreamed. That's the first angle. The second angle is that we're taking Gramsci's approach of metapolitics to try to understand how and why these criminalization rhetorics, how these narratives are accepted by the voting population. So not just looking top down from what these parties are saying, what their election manifestos are saying, what policies they're proposing, but how these are specifically tailored to capitalize upon existing discontent and existing anxieties within populations. Now, a large part of this develops from our work on Euroscepticism, which is quite different to right-wing radicalization around criminalization, but has a similar theme in that, yes, there are similarities between countries, but there are fundamental differences between countries as well. So we're building upon this argument that just as there are multiple different Euroscepticisms, there are multiple different radical right narratives across Europe which vary amongst each other and which don't necessarily reflect the narratives that we see coming out of the United States, or as Chris's presentation just demonstrated, coming out of other parts of the world. So we're looking at Austria and France in this. With the FPO and the National Rally, as it's now called, sharing many similarities, both emerging in the aftermath of the Second World War, both being quite fringe until the very, very end of the 20th century and capitalizing on discontent in the 21st century. So a lot of similarities, but also significant differences between them, looking at how they narrate this. So a starting point is that we examine the rise of the radical right in the 21st century and its ontological distinction between the old right and the extreme right. So a constant issue that we face when trying to understand the rise of the right is, which right are we talking about? We're not talking about the old right. And for the purposes of this presentation and the research that Murat and I are doing, we approach the old right as being the sort of traditional Burkean conservatism which dominated throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, appeals to authority, appeals to tradition, often a quite upper middle to upper class phenomenon of maintaining national identity and maintaining structures as they are. The old conservative right, the sort of country club Republicans or the Conservatives in the United Kingdom, or Les Républicains in France, who now seem to be extinct. That would be the old right. The extreme right we define as a sort of 20th century hangover of neo-Nazism. So if the old right is the country club Republicans, the extreme right we would see as, to give a British or English analogy, skinheads fighting in a pub car park. You know, the sort of extreme neo-Nazism that certainly still exists. But the radical right that we're looking at is what a Guardian article a few years ago termed hipster fascism. It's often appealing to well-educated, quite well-off younger people, and it blends philosophies from across the political spectrum. Yes, we've got elements of the old right, elements of the extreme right, but also elements borrowed or simply stolen from the centre, the left, even green and environmental positions. The second element that we're taking, and we're using Austria and France and the mainstreaming of the radical right there, is to look at the phenomenon of mainstreaming through, as I say, a Gramscian political lens. So we've chosen migration to look at how this issue, which used to be relatively fringe for Austrian and French radical right populists, how it has become much more securitized, and how migration is being framed as a security issue and a criminal issue, changing significantly from what we might term a medicalization of immigration in the late 20th century towards a securitization and a criminal, and it being narrated and framed as a criminal issue. Now, a major part of this mainstreaming, we want to understand how these parties have gained such traction in European, local, and parliamentary elections. And it does look like the National Rally are going to be the next French government. So not just looking at what they're doing, but why it is being picked up upon by voters. A significant part of this is that both parties, the FPO in Austria and RN in France, have followed a pattern that we've seen by other European, Western, and global radical right movements, which is the development of policy areas beyond simply opposition to immigration, to connecting immigration to these wider social public anxieties and consistently framing it as a security issue and a crime issue. So, as we argue in this paper, the FPO and Rassemblement National have always been relatively anti-immigrant, but this has accelerated because in the last 20, 25 years, they've been able to connect this to more mainstream social issues, such as availability of housing, such as employment, education, healthcare, access to welfare, all of these sorts of things. And as a consequence, the FPO in Austria and Rassemblement National in France demonstrate this shift from an extreme right position, a sort of naked, overt neo-Nazi position, to a much more radical right position, which maintains a lot of the same stances, a lot of the same policy positions, but masks it with a veneer of civilization, with to go back to that phrase, a hipster fascism. It masks these with a veneer of being a much more middle-class, acceptable mainstream position. But this is simply hiding a continuing narrative of criminalizing immigrants and criminalizing immigration as an issue. So we are approaching this issue through a Gramscian theory of hegemony and metapolitics. Gramsci's argument initially being that politics is downstream from economics, rephrased as politics being downstream from culture. So we are looking at the changing culture bottom up, not something that the radical right has created, but something that the radical right is able to capitalize and build upon. This is something that the radical right are extremely good at doing. It's seeing where the wind is blowing socially and being able to tie these themes, these anxieties, to their policy issues. They are extremely adaptable, as we'll see from the Austrian and French examples. And both of these major parties demonstrate this metapolitical theme of being able to build upon large transnational radical right populist social movements. So not simply national political parties, but social movements which try to change the fabric of society, which appeal to anxieties, which communicate narratives, and which can transcend borders. And so we're in this position where, yes, there is Yes, there are significant similarities across borders. Yes, there are major national differences. And the political parties, such as FPO and RN, are able to build upon these, capitalize on these anxieties. But there are still these wider social movements in which vague populist narratives, so that build upon radical right positions, are able to change the fabric, change voters' opinions, and politicians are able to build upon these, especially with the rise of social media and digital communications in the 21st century. So we give a very brief background on the selection of the case studies of why we've looked at these. So we've got two parties here, the Freedom Party of Austria, FPO, and Rassemblement National, the National Rally in France, both sharing some similarities but significant differences. So the FPO emerged in 1955 in Austria, 1956 in Austria, a year after the Allied withdrawal. And the FPO had been essentially founded by former National Socialist Party members in Austria. So members of the old New Order. Indeed, Anton Reithaler, their first leader, had been a former minister of the German National Socialist era and had been a brigadier general in the SS. So it was building upon the sort of older 20th century extreme right, something that we didn't see with the Front National, which only emerged in the 1970s. Now, FPO began as an extreme far-right position, obviously building upon the National Socialists. But by the 1980s, they were starting to go through significant internal shifts, and the election of Norbert Steger in 1980 as president of the FPO signified a major shift from the old extreme Nazi past of the FPO into a much more, what they wanted to appear as a much more liberal, acceptable mainstream party. And this accelerated with the election in 1986 of Jörg Haider after overthrowing Norbert Steger. Now, Haider did adopt more radical right positions and significantly increased the party's stance on anti-immigration at a time of increasing anxieties around immigration. So we see that with the FPO begins as very extreme right, a hangover of the neo-Nazis, of the actual Nazis, but shifting in the later 20th century towards this more ostensibly liberal position. And as immigration became increasingly important in the late 1980s, the party was able to capitalize upon this. We saw this change in the 1990s with the end of the Cold War and the FPO shifting from an overtly anti-communist fascist rhetoric towards a more Eurosceptic and anti-immigration position. And by October 1999, the FPO was able to actually get into government as part of a coalition with the Austrian People's Party. Now, this was the first example of a radical right party in Europe, or an extreme right party in Europe, depending on how you want to look at it, actually coming into power, something that Rassemblement National has not been able to achieve. Now, in the early 2000s, with the election of Heinz Christian Strache as leader of the party in April 2005, we saw an even greater shift towards anti-immigration rhetoric. So abandoning a lot of the old ethnic nationalism, the old Nazism of the FPO, and shifting towards an overt anti-immigrant discourse and rhetoric. And as a consequence, this put FPO in a strong position to be able to capitalize upon the large-scale migration coming into Europe following the Arab Spring of 2011. So Austria being a transit country for a lot of migrants and refugees fleeing the Syrian civil war in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, the FPO was in a position to be able to capitalize on this. So this is something that we see across European parties in Austria, in Europe, of the radical right or the extreme right being almost very deliberately vague and therefore able to capitalize upon external events, which they didn't cause, but which they're able to benefit from, to capitalize on. And the FPO in particular was able to frame this as being not an immigration issue, but an Islamic and thereby, in their imagination, a criminal issue. We saw this sort of rhetoric coming out at the time of the migration crisis from 2014 to 2016 of FPO politicians framing this as an invasion, framing this as a securitization way. So not just a cultural way, not just an economic issue as immigration has so often been portrayed, but explicitly being framed as a security and crime issue. I'm aware that the clock is ticking, so I'll quickly move on to Rassemblement National. Now, here we do see a difference. So going back to this starting point that Murat and I have of looking at distinctions between national manifestations of the far right. So the National Rally only emerges just under 20 years after the FPO in Austria, and initially, like FPO, had been an anti-communist entity. So yes, very strong anti-Semitism in it, very strong elements of reacting to the breakup of the French Empire in the 20th century, something that we didn't see in FPO, but continuing a lot of the themes that we did see with FPO of being anti-communist, and under Jean-Marie Le Pen being very overtly part of what we would call the old 20th century far right, the extreme right. But again, we see a major shift in the late 1990s to the early 2000s. Now, Front National has not been able to gain political power across France, except for mayoral positions and local elections where they're not able to shape public policy at a national level. But we have seen Front National achieve something more than the FPO in a meta-political sense. So where the FPO was able to build upon this criminalization narrative of immigration to get into power and then quickly lost popularity and then regained it a few years later, Front National didn't get into power, but we're able to capitalize on this in a way that we see other radical right movements in Europe performing. They don't get into power, but they're able to gain a significant voice to shape the policies of other parties, what Cynthia Miller-Idris defines as the defining issue of mainstreaming. We see a very similar thing, or we did see a very similar thing with Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, having a large public voice, being able to snipe from the sidelines and thereby influencing major parties to adopt rhetoric, narratives around criminalization of immigration, of moving away from looking at immigration as an economic issue to a cultural, to a criminal, securitized issue, and because they're not in government, without actually having to take responsibility for their positions, something that FPO did have to do when they came into coalition government twice and lost a great deal of popularity as a consequence. FN was able to avoid this. So we've seen significant differences, but also very significant parallels between the two. Now, we want to look at how they've become mainstream. And we're focusing significantly on what has happened in the aftermath of the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008, the migration crisis of 2014 onwards, but significantly since the pandemic onwards, because we've seen an acceleration of mainstreaming and meta-political changes across Europe. And looking at these two case studies, we can see similar phenomena coming out. So how have they become mainstream? Both of these parties had very strong elements of, I was going to say neo-Nazi, old Nazi, the sort of 1940s actual new order tropes, anti-Semitism, anti-communism, but quickly abandoned those in the 21st century in order to present this veneer of civilization. Now, this is the supply side of the FPO and NR on criminalizing migration. They change their positions, change their communication strategies, but there's also the demand side that they are able to capitalize upon. Both of these parties and other parties in Europe and across the world have been able to capitalize on wider public economic anxieties and disillusionment with political culture more broadly. So by framing migration as a criminal issue, and framing migrants as potential criminals, absolutely can wrap up, they are able to build upon these existing anxieties with a system which so many people feel is rigged against them, and in a society, in a social fabric where people are struggling to pay their bills, pay rent, where young people are struggling to get jobs or get on the housing ladder, the radical right is able to present itself using this veneer of civilization as saying, we will protect you against criminalization. So quickly, a few more things. Metapolitics is much easier in this era of digital communications. Take Rassemblement National, where Jordan Bardella has been embarking on a de-demonization campaign using social media to portray himself having a beer with his mates in a pub garden somewhere, rather than doing Elon Musk style Roman salutes at the high level of politics, at the everyday level of politics. The radical right, like FPO and RN, they don't just create social media accounts, they capitalize on existing anxieties which are expressed through social medias. Three final things. Narratives tying immigrants to crime become very, very popular in an era of social anxiety around the economic situation and general dissatisfaction with traditional politics. Penultimate issue is that both of these parties have demonstrated a shift from what we might term the medicalization of immigration to the criminalization of immigration. So shifting from seeing immigrants as a threat to culture to being a threat to social order. We've seen both of them doing this since their formation in the 20th centuries. And a final thing, we've seen that Rassemblement National and FPO are able to capitalize on local issues, national issues, but wider European issues, as both have shifted from being very anti-European Union and Eurosceptic to shifting to Euro-alternativism, not wanting to leave the European project, but wanting to take over the project as part of what they see as a necessary securitization of the European continent against what they term a great replacement. And on that delightfully cheerful note, we'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Russell. So our next and last presenter, Saga, the floor is yours.
Perfect, thank you. I hope you can hear me all right. 2 seconds, I have some slides, so I'll share those. Can you see that? Yeah, okay, perfect. Right, yes, I'm Saga Skinstrand. Thank you so much for having me. I was supposed to present in December, but I managed to get the flu, so I'm very happy to be here. And yes, I'm presenting this article that I'm planning on trying to publish quite soon. That's based on some fieldwork that I did in Sweden. So I'll go straight into it. I'm really coming from a perspective of looking at party-based linkage and kind of this kind of older literature on crisis of representation and how parties build linkages with their constituencies within new conditions. And where I'm really hoping this article can contribute is in how we place populism within this literature. And I've presented this a couple of times with different framings because I'm still trying to figure out the how to kind of frame the literature, because there's no real good summary, I would argue, in how populism is placed here. We usually assume certain things about populism. So for example, Peter Mayer described populist democracy as a popular democracy without parties, or that it works within a notion of democracy that can work without the intervention of the party. So here I'm really interested in how populist parties build linkage with constituencies and their membership. And I'll come to that later, but of course this is also coming from a perspective of new research showing that especially radical right populist parties in Europe are building very strong membership organizations and reviving the mass party, as some claim. So just mentioning some of the main sources that I think kind of summarize what I'm talking about when I say that we make certain assumptions about how populism works. So just starting with the theory, for example, we have this kind of populism versus constitutionalism. So on the one side, we would have this kind of indirect, the mediated character of representation that we would assume is constitutional democracy. So here we have law and institutions, and an emphasis on procedures, checks and balances. Here we have pluralism and minority rights, which we would define as constitutional democracy. And on the other side, we would have like a populist democracy. So here we see the sovereignty of the people as the only source of legitimacy, immediacy. So we don't want this kind of rule of law, checks and balances. We want this direct expression. I think we all know this kind of definition of what populism is. So if you talk about representation or linkage, you would have like this indirect, mediated representation on the one side, and populism represents this immediate expression of the people's will, so a direct linkage between the people and decision making. Then we have, for example, Creasy talking about like also intermediaries. So populists are against intermediaries. This is a different way of describing what I would argue the same thing. So again, kind of describing how populism as an ideology or just populist parties in general are kind of against intermediaries like institutions, everything that represents these like checks and balances. It's anti-pluralist, so here again, opponents are illegitimate. So all of these kind of build up to this rejection of mediation. If you look at populism as strategy, you can also see similar tendencies within the literature. Perhaps emphasis on a charismatic leader, bypassing institutions, going on his charisma or her charisma rather than through established parties and institutions. So this is just my way of kind of summarizing how the different perspectives of populism, and there are a lot, kind of make the same kind of assumptions and conclusions about how populism should organize and how populist parties and movements, how they should approach institutions and mediation. We also see, for example, if we look at how parties organize in practice, we see similar things. So again, reliance on personalization and charismatic leadership. Of course, we've seen many, many examples of this. Some mentioned today. We've seen very weak institutions and this kind of anti-partyism, not really wanting to be a party, which of course comes with this package of being anti-establishment. Memberless parties, for example, is a term used in the literature. Plebiscitary linkage or direct representation or direct communication. So again, coming down to this directness, skipping institutions and bypassing mediation. And then, of course, both on left and right, we've seen a lot of this kind of movement style mobilization. So leader-driven, again, never really institutionalizing, perhaps coming from, especially on the left, coming from a grassroots movement. And these have also been called kind of gaseous parties, so coming very quickly, but then, of course, disappearing also very quickly as they never really managed to institutionalize or didn't want to institutionalize. So here we see some kind of the same pattern on both from a theoretical point of view, but also how they've organized in practice. Another way of describing this is, of course, also just populism being a part of a wider movement of all parties moving towards more direct forms of linkage. So parties increasingly struggling to build the kind of party-based linkages that they used to be able to build. So if we think like the heyday of the mass party, and of course, the very classic literature of parties moving to kind of catch all, and then perhaps cartel parties, and moving to more direct forms of linkages. Again, you have Peter Mayer kind of describing this and this void between citizens and decision-making, and parties withdrawing from civil society and becoming a part of the state, and perhaps civil society being more drawn towards social movements. So here, of course, populism can also just be described as like an endpoint or a symptom of this movement. But again, it's describing kind of the same thing. So perhaps just because a lot of the populist parties are fairly new, they might not exist the tools or the resources for building the party-based linkage that we would assume a normal party would build. So that's kind of me summarizing the literature here. So against this background, we would have certain assumptions about how populist parties work. It's quite astounding that we're now seeing this general trend in many radical right populist parties, not all of them, kind of investing in their local organizations, so building local branches, party offices, networks, recruiting a lot of members, official members, perhaps paying dues, and also offering a lot of opportunities on the local level for activism and advancement of these members. There's also been some work on how these parties have built collective identities, using some of the classic literature on how mass parties would organize, and looking at how they're using kind of similar tactics as we would assume an old mass party would do. And one important aspect of this is, of course, that this would also, which makes this kind of puzzling, is that it also kind of defies this kind of cost-benefit logic that we would apply normally in, when looking at party membership. So there's a lot of stigma of these parties. There's not a lot of career incentives in a lot of countries anyways, where if you start off in this party, a radical right populist party, you might not be able to move on to other things afterwards. So there are very high costs and not a lot of benefits, but still people are joining. So it doesn't really fit in the way we describe why parties are struggling maintaining a large membership, where we would kind of apply this cost-benefit logic. So, for example, removing the membership dues for members or young members or students and making it cheaper and easier to become a member. This is usually how we approach membership studies of parties, but this seems to be, there seems to be something else going on here. So what I wanted to look at this, and I will soon talk about which party, but of course in Sweden, I already mentioned that. And I really wanted to focus on this perspective of linkage. So how these parties actually construct and sustain this kind of linkage with members and supporters. If it was just kind of a symbolic thing, they didn't have any power, because of course we would also assume that populist radical right parties are kind of don't allow a lot of power to members and within the party. So intra-party democracy, but also mainly from the members' perspective, I was very interested in how they perceived their own role within the party, to what extent they believed in the mediating power of the party. So that was really what I was looking for, talking to members to see how they would frame their own role within democracy. And you can see on the screen that I have included how Katzenmayer described the mass party. So when these parties come with in the early 1900s, you really see the parties as this vehicle for change, usually for underrepresented segments of the population. So emanating from civil society and really being the vehicle for the segment of the population to really penetrate the state and to gain access to rooms of decision making. And of course, they then describe how parties are moving towards the state, but this was really the kind of relationship we have to parties, I would argue, and how we see them. So this was really what I was interested in. We can find the same in the populist radical right, and if so, how they are able to build such a relationship. So this was an ethnographic study I did last year with party members of different levels within the party, the Sweden Democrats. Again, looking at the members' perspective, perceptions, the role, and yeah, how it understood itself and how this was kind of described discursively. So really looking at the party as this kind of discursively constituted institution. And yeah, I did interviews and also participant observation of meetings and local activities. And just some background of the Sweden Democrats. I'm sure most of you already know, I'm guessing. But of course, it's Sweden's radical right party. It has grown very, very quickly. It comes from the 80s, actually, so it's not a very young party, really, but it entered parliament in 2010, so it's still fairly new within the political arena in Sweden, and has been claimed to also have attracted a lot of social democratic voters and working class voters in Sweden. So my findings, and please flag if I'm going on too long. I tend to do that, but I would just like to kind of summarize 3 of the main themes that I kind of argue, well, form the basis of my claim, which is that populism is exactly what made this kind of relationship to their members possible. So really what sustained this relationship between members and party, which we would term the mass party, or the mass party form of building a party, I would argue that it's precisely the populist elements of the party that was able to kind of sustain this kind of relationship. So the first kind of theme that came up through my interviews was this kind of way of representation. So really a strong belief that the party was constituted by ordinary people, and that they had shared interests as a group, although this is never defined. And I just want to mention that none of this is very new. I think we all recognize these themes as very typically populist elements or elements of populism. But I really want to take these kind of elements we take for granted and look at how it affects representation. So yes, the first one was this very strong belief in shared interest as a group. The second one was this very strong belief in membership, so in a formal membership in the party, not just perhaps doing things on social media or other ways of helping or contributing to the party, but actually being a formal member, attending meetings and doing paperwork. And lastly, the efficacy of the party, so really believing in the party as a vehicle for change. And I'll go through each of them. So the first one, as I mentioned, was this very strong belief in the form of representation here, of this kind of representation through resemblance. So a strong belief that the party was composed of ordinary Swedes. That was the identity that they all felt that they belonged to, and really believed that there were certain interests really inherent to this identity of being an ordinary person. And that's really what made the party into what they would describe as like a grassroots movement, because they come from the people and they are for the people. And because the party was constituted by these ordinary Swedes, they knew what ordinary Swedes wanted. So it was like in a really literal sense, and of course a very typical anti-establishment stance, that they were not normal politicians, they were normal people. This was very detached from class, even though perhaps some elements were there of class, but they would very rarely call themselves working class. It was more this identity of ordinary people, sometimes referring to perhaps that they had worked with normal jobs before becoming politicians, or like I include here quotes, so when one is close to life, one also sees the problems. And this is why also they describe that other parties were not responding to, for example, the problems of immigration, because they were detached from society. They might be in Stockholm, in their high buildings, not seeing the problems of the people. And yeah, and this is also kind of reflected in their official communication. This was also a part of this very strong aversion to careerism. Being a part of the party was this moral duty as a citizen, not something you might do to learn or to develop yourself as an individual, but it was really your responsibility, because you felt the responsibility to the Swedish society, that you would join, which goes into this very strong belief in the membership itself as the main form of activism. So here again, joining the party was this moral duty, and the main way to act politically and to change society. It was described as a very courageous thing to do because there's such a strong stigma. Many described, of course, losing touch with a lot of friends or with family members, feeling threatened when they would meet, especially those who had gotten involved very early on. But this seemed to really strengthen this perception that this was a very meaningful thing to do. And yes, again, as I've mentioned, it's really this like formal membership. So perhaps you as an individual would not do a lot of have a lot of power or actually feel like you're creating a lot of change, but just you as a small part of a wider party mattered. Yes, and of course, like I mentioned, this sense of also exclusion, being excluded from the mainstream, and the other parties being very hostile towards them, really reinforced this strong sense of loyalty to the party. And I think this is something we also know from the literature, that this had this effect, even though perhaps they did not plan that. And it also fostered a different kind of participation, I would argue, where they were not able to post this online or share things online, but they had to rely on in-person participation. And I will wrap up this quite quickly. So yes, if you look at how they their way of affiliation, it really resembles more of this classic bullseye model by Duverger, rather than how we might expect a modern party to organize, which again kind of comes back to this old sense of a mass party. And the final thing I want to mention that I think comes into this and wraps everything kind of or combines everything is, of course, this anti-establishment rhetoric that we all know very well, which really created this very, very strong sense of efficacy that I think really distinguishes the party from other parties, where of course, seeing Sweden as being in decline and really in a crisis created this sense of urgency, and feeling that the mainstream parties were self-serving and not listening to the people. All of this going into this very typical anti-establishment rhetoric, but really created a very, very strong sense of moral urgency of joining the party. Many described it as their way of securing a safe future for their children. And again, if you come back to this idea of the party, as Katzenmeier described it, of the mass party, early 1900s, I would argue that these elements really create this kind of relationship to the party, which creates a very, very strong incentive to joining. And I think it gives some clues of why these parties are able to organize in ways that mainstream parties seem to be kind of struggling to imitate. And I think, yeah, that's it. Sorry if I went for too long. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Saga. So now we can move on to our discussants. So Hannah, do you want to begin?
Yeah, I can start. I'll keep it fairly short. Can you hear me okay? Is there a particular order you want me to do it in, or is anything okay?
However you want to do it.
Okay. I might just go backwards since we've just had Saga's one, if that works. And thank you for sending it in advance, because I did get a chance to read the draft that was sent as well. No, all three were super interesting. I really enjoyed. I learned a lot listening to everything. I think with Saga, yours, I particularly like the way you framed the puzzle that you were looking at and looked at this idea. Sorry, I have a very small notebook, so I have to flip back and forth at the moment. But like this idea of what we expect in terms of populism being more direct or more immediate, and assumptions we have about how populist parties are going to organize, and then what we see. And I felt like that challenging of assumptions was very persuasive, also in the paper, and super interesting. And I also liked how by the end of it, you were taking something that should be a contradiction according to kind of what we know already, and saying actually maybe there isn't a contradiction there. So instead of saying like, I think, but by challenging the assumption, instead of saying I'm filling this gap, you were really saying if we pick this apart, there actually maybe isn't as much of a contradiction as we thought. I guess one of the things that I would be interested to hear about, maybe came out less in the presentation, but maybe that gives you more of a chance to expand later, is about the way you talk about parties as discursively constituted. And it strikes me that you take like a very constructivist and interpretivist approach, which I find very persuasive, because it's the kind of approach that I also, I think, generally take, and this idea that only by taking that approach where you see parties as more discursively constructed can you come to the kind of conclusions that you've come to. And I guess maybe that was something I felt like maybe could have been capitalized on more in the paper itself, because you talked a bit, I'm going to find the quote actually, about you kind of gave some caveats at the end, like you're not able to definitively establish a causal relationship. But I think actually like what's really cool about the research you're doing is that it's not about causal relationships, it's about challenging assumptions and what parties actually mean to people, and how parties are understood by people then changes like what we actually think of a party in terms of how it's organized. I hope that makes sense. I'll just go through all three just reflections. Then the one on the Austrian and French radical right, I found super interesting. I've taken so many notes because the immigration element is like where I find it really interesting and how that gets linked to other issues. So I really learned a lot there, and I don't know if I have much kind of on the more critical end. So I'm just going to find I really like the term hipster fascism. I haven't come across that before. I guess one of the questions, my understanding of Gramsci is not extensive, but there's a lot of debate there about culture and then the economic side. I've also been thinking a lot about neoliberalism recently and how that plays in with populism, which also seems to link to this. And you were talking a bit about the supply side and the demand side, and I'm quite interested in, does the demand side come down to economic grievances, or is there a lot more at play there? For me, I'm interested in like I'm based in Scotland, and here I think often the demand side does come down to economic grievances, but I don't know if that's the case elsewhere. And then if you start with the economic grievances and then it's being changed into this like securitization or more cultural discussion, I guess the questions of like how that happens, I just found that really interesting. I'm not sure if that's like something I'm expecting you to answer per se, but I just thought that was a really interesting kind of section of your presentation. Let's see what else. Oh, and also I had a question about intention in terms of you were talking about people being deliberately vague or parties being deliberately vague about what they're trying to achieve. And the word deliberate there, I was quite interested in if there's an actual element of intention behind the vagueness, or if it's something that is kind of more structural in the way that they run their parties. But in that one, I just thought it was super interesting. Especially that argument about linking to current grievances and to other issues, because I think that's super salient across Europe at the moment. And then the last one, thank you so much for the one on criminal populism. Also very interesting. Again, I think maybe something with all three of these, I really enjoyed the challenging assumptions element of the presentation that you gave. So going beyond this idea of the crime warrior politician, and then instead kind of almost flipping that on its head to say that you've got this criminal identity being weaponized, and then even going further and saying that some politicians manage to do both at the same time, which to me sounds like a contradiction, but then the way that you present the empirical data shows that it is something that people manage to hold side by side. So I guess my two questions there was, is there an inherent contradiction that they're almost playing off and with, or is there a way that politicians have managed to be both the crime warriors and the kind of criminals themselves at the same time? So like that element of, are they actually playing with a contradiction here and capitalizing on that, or have they found a way to merge them? And then I was also interested in what you think the role of class is beyond race or migration, because you were talking a lot about the white middle class, and I would be interested to have the the class element of that unpacked further, because my knowledge of your two contexts that you were looking at is very surface level, but at least in Europe, there's definitely an element of these kinds of political crime discourses cutting across what previously we thought were kind of class distinctions or divisions or cleavages. So I guess just that element of it I would be really interested to hear more on. But no, for all three, I really enjoyed it. It was really interesting. Also very clearly framed puzzles, which I really appreciated. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. And Vlad, do you want to also share your thoughts?
Yes, thank you so much. First of all, thanks to the presenters for what have been very interesting papers. I think Hannah brought it up perfectly. Those are papers trying to challenge assumptions, which is always interesting because they foster debate and we can see the same problem from different angles. I will also give some comments. I'll start from the first paper now because I think we reversed the reverse order. So first of all, thank you so much. I think this is the first time I'm actually listening to this topic on criminal populism, moving from penal communism, and it's very interesting. My first point as I was listening was how new is criminal populism in fact? Because you were mentioning Donald Trump, you were mentioning the Philippines case, but in my mind, the first case I was thinking about a political candidate that became a convict and was using this as part of their campaign was actually in the 1920s, Eugene Debs, who was a socialist politician in the US, who got arrested for various reasons. We can debate that. It's not really important. But his slogan during the presidential campaign of 1920 was, and I checked for president, vote convict number 9653. So this is something that's been there for at least 100 years. And of course, there are modern valences that we can debate and frame for this new type of criminal populism, but there are antecedents. And I think it would be nice to actually see whether these antecedents matter, whether there are more where this came from, or whether this is just happening and we have a completely new form of criminal populism that has emerged, irrespective of its previous legacy or whatever you want to call it. Now, the second point I wanted to make was that I think the empirical part, I haven't seen the paper / the book, so I'm just basing my my comments on what I've heard. I think there needs to be a clear connection between the empirics and the conceptual discussion that you're putting forward, because the conceptual discussion is very interesting and it's rather innovative, I would say. And then the empirical facts come and they seem to be a bit adjacent. And I'm not sure exactly how well connected they are. Maybe, and I assume they're much more well connected than detailed in the book. But for now, for example, discussions of, for example, Republican politics in the 1980s and how tough on crime was essential for their platform back then. That's a big causal claim, right? Reagan won because of this. I think his last election against Walter Mondale, he won in every state with the exception of Minnesota because Mondale was from Minnesota. So it just sticks in the back of your mind. And I think you should use the empirics as a backbone for pushing this conceptual innovation, which is indeed very, very interesting, rather than treating them as interesting side notes, because interesting side notes create different debates. But I think the main debate that this project could create is much bigger than that. So it's not just a a collection of anecdotes. It's actually a new conceptual framework of thinking about crime, populism, and how people weaponize their position vis-a-vis the criminal system. So this is very interesting. Now, moving to the second paper, also very interesting, very different from what I'm doing. So I will try to stick to what I understood and what I think I can provide some feedback on. So the first one is how the case selection was done, because I do understand very important big parties. We always speak about them when we talk about the radical right. However, both Austria and France have seen significant increases in the population of immigrants and refugees, various legal categories, since the immigration crisis first begun. So I would be curious, whether similar patterns or divergent patterns would be observed in countries where the new forms of radical right have also emerged, became mainstream, also copied the same anti-immigration discourse. However, there are no immigrants. And I can think more of this in Eastern Europe, for example, where nobody really came to stay in Eastern Europe, but you still have some sort of anti-immigration discourse. Is it the same? Is it different? And if it's different, why is it different? I think it would be interesting to capture this type of potentially deviant case. And the second point I had was more related to the framing, and I think this was a very astute point you were making, that the contemporary form of radical right is very good at seeing where the wind is blowing and adapting their stances based on that. Now, in the actual work, I think I would like to see exactly how that's different than what somebody could listen to this and see, well, that means they're responsive to the electorate. That means they're responsive to some sort of segment of the electorate, of course, not the entire electorate, because that's not the point you're making. But it seemed to me that you're saying at one moment that, well, traditional parties were unresponsive, these parties are responsive, and this is somehow bad, which is definitely not the point you're making, but it could be misread as that, and I really don't think you want that, and the paper deserves to avoid that because it's a very interesting proposal. Okay, and my final point on this paper, I think the main framing in its empirical basis is that the crisis of refugees and immigration more than a decade ago is still matters. However, I think a bit more attention could be paid to what was happening in the first years after 2014, 2015, because while we already saw the far right, radical right, becoming more and more mainstream, they were losing elections at that point. So there were different parties that were actually handling the crisis, and the radical right was the opposition, the vocal opposition, whatever you want to call it, to those mainstream positions. So I think another layer of complexity to your argument would be to make the role of mainstream center-right and center-left parties clearer, in the sense in which I would like to know, under your Gramscian framework, is it truly downstream of culture when culture was not really determined primarily by those parties? They were still, I don't know, trying to join the bandwagon? Could be in the paper again, might be a bit more there, but I think the role of center-left and center-right parties in handling/mishandling the crisis should be articulated a bit more. And finally, moving to the third paper, also thanks a lot for a very interesting discussion and for a nice paper. I think I have two questions. So one of them is, okay, we're talking about populist parties as some sort of contradiction in some way, in some broad way, because why would you, the proponents of direct or more direct democracy, support a vehicle, an institutional vehicle that's primarily designed for representative mediated democracy? And that's a good question. However, I'm not sure if I find it believable that you directly jump to what people within the party say and not without actually asking a similarly important empirical question, namely, do these populist parties actually give more power to the members? Because if the answer is immediately yes, and I'm not sure what's the case with your case study, but if the answer is yes, then that's a completely different type of party. And just because we have the label political party, that might actually reflect a big heterogeneity in terms of what actual types of institutional vehicles politicians can use to reach the audiences. And if indeed those kind of populist parties are so different that we use the label party just because we're used to it, then I think you need a bit of a reframing when you move to the discursive part, in which you use interviews to ask what's happening, what constitutes a party that makes it make sense for the members. And this bridges to the second question. Some of the claims that the people are making, because it's not you making the claims, are kind of testable. So for example, whether those parties are actually made of more ordinary people. I'm sure there's data out there that at least allows us briefly or at some level of granularity to answer, are populist parties, or in my cases, this populist party actually composed of people of different classes, different origins, different levels of education, and different ages? Because if the answer is yes, then your argument is still there and it's still robust. Yes, people do this and believe this because of one of these reasons, but they're actually also right. And I think that's a question also a reviewer might answer. I also read the paper when you sent it, and this was one of the things that from the like putting my reviewer hat on, I was always asking, okay, like the party members they're giving their opinions. Are they right? Or are they lied by somebody, or are they misinformed, or just they just don't care and use their opinion as fact? It doesn't destroy your argument regardless of what the answer is. But I think it's an important answer, because if the answer is yes, they claim that this is what makes a populist party different and they're right, well, then the populist party is actually different. If they claim something about the populist party and they're wrong, then there's another layer of somebody or something convincing them that there's a difference, which could be leveraged either in this paper or in subsequent work, because as researchers, we always think about the future directions for research. But all in all, thanks everyone for the very nice presentations. It was a very, very pleasant evening.
Thank you so much, Vlad. So now I think I would suggest that we can open the floor to the audience. Maybe we could collect a few questions and then have some time for the presenters to reflect on both the comments of the discussants and any questions from the audience. So does anyone here have any questions? You can either put it in the chat or raise your hand. I also just want to highlight in the chat, there is sort of more of a comment from Heidi, who had to leave, but just seconding the question that Hannah had for Chris on the anti-crime criminal paradox in light of the shooting of a US citizen in Minnesota yesterday, and how this plays out in ICE rhetoric and performativity as well. So does anyone, just want to put a question in the chat or raise your hand? Okay, well, I can start with a question also that I had for Russell. I really liked the paper, and I think one thing that sort of in your typology of the different right-wing parties, of the old right, the extreme right, and the new radical right, something that kind of struck me is you mentioned the old right has a sort of prioritizes tradition, this kind of Burkean legacy. But it seems like with a lot of the radical right, there's a different kind of tradition being invoked. I mean, we just see that also culturally with this sort of defense of what is considered to be traditional gender roles, family structures. So I guess maybe sounds a bit paradoxical, but the changing role of tradition for right-wing parties, could reflect on that maybe.
Thank you. Do you want me to reflect now, or shall we take?
I'll still wait, maybe give a couple minutes for other questions. If anyone else wants to chime in. Yeah, Bülent?
Yeah, thank you very much. All of the presentations are quite interesting, and I learned a lot. My questions is for Saga. Actually, I live in Stockholm, so I also follow lively the political situation in Sweden, and I have big concerns about how the ST rising its voting base. But I wonder whether there is also some populist elements as it is in ST in other political parties, starting from Venstre to Christian Democrats or moderates and Social Democrats, because we see that especially with Tido Aftal, Tido contract, the other mainstream political parties come under the influence of the ST, and they are also repeating the same discourses, especially related to criminality and also the migration issue. So I wonder whether she could determine any similar strategies, similar narratives, similar attitudes, similar politics from other political parties in Sweden politics. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, I guess if there's not other questions, maybe we can pass the floor back to our presenters to respond. I know that there was a lot of feedback and a lot of questions, so feel free to kind of prioritize or select what you'd like to respond to or what you'd like to highlight. And if you could, I think just for the sake of time, try to keep it around 5 minutes per presenter, that would be wonderful. So maybe we can just go back in the order that we presented. So if Chris, you want to start.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm gonna start with Vlad comments. You're right, the using crime as a political capital, especially the criminal identity of the politicians, it's been a really old tradition, not only in 1920, but since the colonization. The chapter 1 of my book, it's about how state power emerged from crime. And I started the chapter talking about when the United States colonized the Philippines and how the US itself, like all the components of criminal populism, is from the colonial period. You name it, eugenics, othering, the criminalization of the others, propaganda machines, militarizations of the police and surveillance. And I talk about here about the colonial feedback loop. The colonial feedback loop is how these practices of colonizations bring back to the United States at the modern time and use it as a strategy to enhance the identity of criminal politicians. So that's the chapter 2. So I started with history, especially during colonization, and arguing that criminal populism is not a new trend. It's been happening even before, during the colonization, and all the component of criminal populism actually started during the colonial period of the US. And that's the reason it's a really good comparative study between criminal populism in the Philippines and criminal populism in the United States. Because when I started studying this back home, I thought before that this is a developing country, third world country kind of phenomenon, but when it happened here in the United States, oh, it's not. Okay. And then I started exploring in other countries too, and it's happening. How politicians like identify, capitalize their own crime as a political capital. And um I don't know if you also commented. I think it's Hannah who commented about, are they playing with the identity of the class, of the poor, and like the issue of poor and class. And you are right. They are really playing with the identity of the poor. When Donald Trump was running as a president in his second term, there's a headline in New York Times that my after the release of his mugshot photo, he was able to raise millions of dollars. Okay. And at the same time, he claimed that his popularity rating among the African American just went up because of that mugshot photo. So he intentionally connect that criminal identity to the criminalized population of the African American in the United States. And it's the same way during the Duterte administration in the Philippines. Rodrigo Duterte, despite of his war against drugs, that I term war against the poor because most of the victims are the poor, he ended his term with 87% approval rating across class. And there's a big approval rating among the lower income class despite of his war against the poor. And in similar situation, Bill Clinton, so I'm talking about now, Vlad, about empirical evidence here. Bill Clinton, during his last term, he has a really high approval rating among African American despite of Monica Lewinsky controversy during that time. Because Bill Clinton is considered by the African American community as an African president during that time. So there's always a connection of identity, of representation. They always these criminal populists always represent the identity, but at the same time, while representing the identity of the minority and of this class, they are also going against them. So there's a lot of irony and contradiction, like what you said, Hannah. There's a lot of contradiction, and that's the reason it's really interesting for me to investigate this phenomenon of emerging type of, despite that its origin is during the colonial period. It is right now that in the right time that I started investigating it as an emerging phenomenon that shifting away from the penal authoritarian type of populism. And thank you again.
Thank you so much. So Russell, do you want to briefly answer some of the questions or comments?
Can do. Thank you very much to all of the respondents for these great points. So I'll take them in reverse order to reflect what we did earlier. So on the point of typology, old, extreme, radical, yes, the radical right does invoke these new traditions. I mean, we could argue that the old right is just invoking manufactured traditions. If we go back to Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger and their invention of tradition, that the radical right is doing the same thing. They're appealing to traditions, even though they've been made up in recent years. So one project I'm working on at the moment is exactly what you pointed out. For example, things like gender roles and how new traditions have been manufactured around these. So you look at a lot of radical right rhetoric on gender roles, and it's this weird, very, very hyper-masculinized, hyper-feminized world where in so many radical right imaginations, you don't have men and women, you have, steroid-fueled bodybuilders and submissive 1950s trad wives. So this is something we just didn't see 10, 15 years ago. So exactly, gender is a very good example of how they're creating these new traditions, but it comes back to what Hannah pointed out on supply versus demand. The radical right could demand anything. They could offer these narratives, but they're not going to gain any traction unless there is an appetite in society for these narratives to be picked up on. So another thing that they're very good at capitalizing on is this idea of a besieged or threatened European civilization, which is absolutely not what they were saying 15, 20 years ago when they were all very Eurosceptic. So yet the typology, these are not three mutually exclusive areas, old right, extreme right, radical right. They blend into one another. To take Vlad's point there, why the case selection? Yeah. We chose these because we wanted to have a balance between, a big country with a lot of influence in Europe. So we took France, and then a smaller country where there's not as much influence. They tend to be overshadowed by German narratives. Also a large country where the radical right is very prominent, but has never got into national office, versus a country where they have got into office twice and, pardon my French, buggered things up, but then their popularity just seems to rebound. So both of these have seen large-scale immigration. Both of them have seen similar sort of narratives coming out. You asked, do we see the same thing in countries where there is much less immigration? Yes, absolutely. We see this in Poland, in Hungary. We saw this in the United Kingdom at the time of the big migration crisis in 2014, 2015, where basically no one came to Britain, but our news was full of it. And a large part of this is, well, very quickly twofold. One, digital communications. 20 years ago, you would wait for the 6 o'clock news to find out what was happening in the world. The last 10 years, you're doom scrolling on your phone while the kettle boils in the morning. And when you see things happening in other countries, parties and politicians in countries that aren't affected are able to capitalize on this. The second one would be because in the last 15 years, we've seen this shift into a civilizational narrative. It's not a case of, Italy is threatened by migration. It's narrated as Europe or the West, which is often a veneer for white society is threatened. So you get this nationalization and Europeanization at the same time. You ask, if they are reflecting the electorate's concerns, is that necessarily bad? No, it's not. There are lots of people across Europe in these countries who have these sort of concerns and feel they're not being listened to. The point we're trying to make, and you're right, we should make this a lot more clear. We're not arguing that it's bad for right-wing movements to actually pick up on what people are concerned about. We're arguing it's bad the way that they frame it, the way that it's narrated as it being an existential and civilizational threat. So by criminalizing it, by spreading these narratives of criminality and an existential threat, it goes from, oh, we should do something about large-scale immigration to let's kick out everyone who doesn't look like us. An example of this from Britain would be back in 2017 when we had the hostile environment towards migration, and it ended up resulting in the Windrush generation being threatened with deportation. You know, people who'd moved from the Caribbean in the late 1940s and are more English than me, being told, oh, well, you're not really one of us because of this criminalization rhetoric. Hannah's point, yeah, I would love to take credit for hipster fascism. Sadly, it's something I can't actually appropriate. 1 minute left. Is it supply and demand? Does demand side come down to economics? Yes, it does, but it's not just economics. So it can also be things that are economic adjacent, like high rent, inability to get home ownership, educational job opportunities, that sort of thing, but also political disillusionment in the system, and a response to what we might call awkwardly peak woke and woke fatigue of people feeling just exhausted by this, and the right wing offers an alternative to it. They're very, very adaptable. I'm doing research at the moment on how the radical right is making huge headway in the LGBTQ community because of these sort of disillusionments and responses. Final point, and this is something that the far left tries to do, but they're really bad at it because they're stuck with repeating arguments from the 19th century, while the radical right is vague and adaptable. And the final point you made, are they doing it deliberately? I don't know. Even if I go and interview these people, they're not going to say, yeah, we're being deliberately vague. So whether it's deliberate or not, I don't think we can know. If I'm feeling generous, I would say it's a deliberate choice so that they can be just vague enough to be relevant and capitalize on anything. If I was feeling ungenerous, I would say it's because they're incapable of coming up with any competent policy positions.
Thank you so much, Russell. And Saga, do you want to also respond to some of the questions and comments?
Yes, sure, I'll be quick. Thank you for the comments. It's very useful to hear. Just to answer the questions, I wrote down the comments. I don't think I have to say much about them. Do they give power to the members? I think this differs between different populist radical right parties. In Sweden, yes, but not actually like less than other parties. They don't have a very strong internal democracy within the parties. I think that's the most typical. And it's also something I do address in the article, to what extent this matters if they actually have party democratic power within the party. I think it adds something to the puzzle, actually, that they don't, because we would assume that giving members more power would be an incentive for them to join. So it's quite interesting that they act power. And of course, this is usually also justified through the stigma and the exclusion. So because there's such a high stigma, it's very important that they behave and that they really control their public image. So it's very risky to give a lot of democratic power to just local members. And it's also something that is worsening, however you want to look at it, with time, because obviously as they gain power and are now supporting a coalition in government, it's even more important now to control the stigma and try to kind of de-radicalize in the public view. And are they ordinary? So are the claims by the members true? It's a fair question. I think there is a few studies by the same authors with the same data. I think 2 articles. So there's not a lot of data on the specific politicians, but there is a study looking at, for example, the education of these politicians, of the Sweden Democrats, that they are lower. They have lower education. They have lower incomes before becoming politicians, so they might have a different background, many of them, compared to other parties. And this also, I think, comes with being a newer party. For example, to climb in a very established party like the Social Democrats, you would have to be a member for a long time, and it's just a different structure, while the Sweden Democrats grew very, very quickly. So they needed people to become politicians very early on in their political careers. Does it matter? I don't know. I think I'm not interested in my article to assess if what they are claiming is true. I don't think that's the point of the article, although it's very interesting and I would like to know. Um, I might write something about this if I manage to clean the data enough, but um, for this article, I wasn't really interested in assessing their claims, but mostly look at how their claims are kind of sustaining a certain form of organization. So that's why I'm not really looking into truth claims. But perhaps the reviewer will think differently. We'll see. And finally, is there populism in other parties? I think you're making a good point, and it's interesting that you're living in Sweden. Yes, I think in Sweden and many other European countries, we're seeing parties like really move in the direction of the radical right, following their footsteps, either in the immigration issue or just like adopting a more populist discourse. And what I find very, very interesting, and now I'm doing ethnographic work with the Social Democrats to kind of compare, is how they're also kind of relating to the Sweden Democrats, what they can appropriate and what they cannot. And I think this also goes into a lot of my findings in this article, but that I did not have time to discuss, is of course they have such a strong agenda setting role, and they know that they are shaping the political agenda, and that they all the parties are following their stances. And of course, this really, really reaffirms this sense of efficacy, and that the party is very strong and powerful. So every time you can really see how it's reflected within the party organization, that it's just proof that they are in control, and that they are really changing things, is that all the other parties are really following suit. So I think it's a very interesting point. Maybe I hope that answered the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so thank you to all the presenters, and also to the discussants and the audience for such a really engaging session. I learned a lot, and I think all of these papers and discussion together really do a great job of enriching our understanding of the exclusionary nature of populism and the implications of this as well. Just to kind of highlight a few things that occurred to me throughout the presentations and discussion. I think a lot of my insights sort of follow from one of the common themes, which is the way that identity and inclusion and exclusion and crime are constructed. So I think in Chris's presentation, something that I found really interesting was the ways that different types of crimes are treated very differently, in a way that really graphs onto the both horizontal and vertical dimensions of populist exclusion. So on the one hand, there's kind of, among exclusionary populists, there's an attribution of corruption to elite actors, you know, this kind of rhetoric of draining the swamp. But on the other hand, there's also this attribution of criminality to marginalized other populations. And then at the same time, as you pointed out, there is sort of tacit acceptance of certain types of criminality in some cases as a way to combat this status quo. So I think that, you know, really, to me, is very interesting. I think it aligns a lot with the criminological literature of how different crimes are associated with different things. I'm, for instance, a really big fan of country music, and someone pointed out to me a little bit of the way that there's sort of in some cases, there's a law and order mentality about certain things like drugs or, you know, things like that. But then there's also a very, you know, country singers sing a lot about driving drunk and other types of crime that are sort of associated with a different type of identity. So, yeah, so I found that really interesting. And then as recent events show, with the US's strikes against Venezuela previously last year, and then the extradition of Maduro earlier this week. I think the ways in which different types of law, such as domestic law, the war on drugs, as well as international law, kind of sometimes conflict or are perceived to conflict and are judged differently is really interesting. And I think the adaptive elements of exclusion and how just these movements frame things differently based on shifting circumstances and adapting to popular grievances was another theme that I thought I found really interesting. And I think that also speaks to the mainstreaming aspect. I know I'm thinking of Aurélien Mondon's work on how the perception of certain views as coming from below creates the conditions through which mainstream parties can adopt these views. So I think the ways that legitimate grievances like that are austerity, housing crisis, affordability become linked with these politics of exclusion is a really interesting point to look at how these views become increasingly adopted by non-populist actors. So I'll leave it there. I really enjoyed this. Thank you to ECPS for putting this on, and wishing you all a wonderful 2026. I know Stella had a few closing words, so I'll pass the floor back to her.